Before we begin our virtual program, it is important to recognize that Berkeley sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold the University of California, Berkeley more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. Hello, and welcome to the virtual tour for Present Tense, 5 Centuries of Colonialism in Latin American and Caribbean Art at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. My name is Joseph Albanese, and I am one of the graduate student curators of this exhibition from UC Berkeley's History of Art department. My co-hosts on this virtual tour are Christine Theunissen from UC Berkeley's History of Art department, Alejandra Decker from UC Berkeley's Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and Gabi Lesser from UC Berkeley's Department of Spanish and Portuguese. This exhibition was developed from a graduate student seminar on colonial art taught by Professor Todd Olson from UC Berkeley's History of Art department and Yvonne De Valle from UC Berkeley's Department of Spanish and Portuguese. Present Tense explores the ways in which art from colonial societies and their successors can use vision to make us feel uncomfortable, powerful, aware, and connected. It aims to bridge our contemporary experiences with the sense of sight to those of people who lived in the Americas over the past 5 centuries. While we walk you through some highlights of this exhibition, think about how these artworks make you feel. Because this exhibition speaks to the continuing colonial experience in the Americas, you may notice works of different styles and periods which appear side by side in the exhibition. This is a noteworthy and intentional break from how art exhibitions are typically organized. How do these pieces work together to create a single, complicated narrative about vision? What relationship does power have to vision? As we move forward, we encourage you to keep these questions in the back of your mind. As you will see while we move through the virtual tour, the exhibition is divided into 4 sections, each of which plays differently on themes of sight. The first section is simply titled Looking and links back to the second section, Looking Back. Section 3, titled Mirada Incómoda, explores the idea of colonial discomfort, while the fourth part, Overlooked, considers little studied subjects in art from colonial societies. As we move through the exhibition, think about the continuities and differences between each section of it. On a final note, before we continue this virtual tour of Present Tense, please feel free to visit the physical exhibition. The Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive is displaying this show until June 20th, 2021. While we have put in our best efforts to give you a thematic overview of the exhibition here, there are many artworks on display which we will not get a chance to discuss in this virtual program. With that in mind, and without further ado, we hope you will enjoy our virtual tour. Thank you for listening. Welcome to the beginning of our exhibition. The title of this part is Looking, and it explores different dynamics of the gaze in the colonial Americas. More specifically, this section explores changing power dynamics in colonial societies with pieces that focus on race and political authority. As modern observers, what do we see within a gaze? How do the artworks in this section tell a story about authority and who is supposed to view the works themselves? It is important to keep in mind that not all of these artworks were meant to hang within a museum, especially those created before the 20th century. Additionally, this section highlights works which have religious themes. Religion was an extremely important part of colonial societies in that conversion of indigenous peoples, often a violent process, served as a political justification for the continued political and social dominance that European powers like Spain exercised over their faraway colonies. Some of the works in this part of the exhibition portray holy objects. What was their purpose, and how do the figures in these pieces interact with those objects? What are the motivations in creating images containing holy authorities and devotional settings? These are some of the key questions you may want to consider while we present some of the artworks from this portion of present tense. In this small panel by an unknown artist, curtains open to show us a scene of a friar kneeling before an altar which displays a crucifix. The rough brushstrokes and simple features of the subjects of this painting indicate that it was intended for local or personal use. However, what is perhaps most worthy of highlighting is the composition. The curtains effectively separate the viewer from subject, creating a barrier. The friar prays intently and remains completely unaware of the fact that we are observing him. What power does this give the viewers of this piece? By contrast, another artwork in this section completely changes that power dynamic. This is a 16th century portrait of Enrique de Azevedo, who ruled the Spanish Netherlands in the 1580s. He gazes outward toward the viewer, his gaze asserting his power as much as his wardrobe. While this portrait might make the modern viewer feel uneasy, it is an ultimate status symbol. You may notice, for instance, a chain with a gilded shell around the count's neck toward the viewer's bottom right of the portrait. This indicates that he belonged to Spain's most noble aristocratic order of Santiago, or St. James, who was the patron saint of conquest in that empire. Numerous images of St. James from around the time this one was painted include the saint mercilessly killing non-Christians, including indigenous people. Cruel as they are, images like those and this portrait represented the power of the Spanish Empire and its ruling class. Other artworks in this section, meanwhile, appropriate the gaze as an act of resistance. How might we interpret these two images alongside Manuel Alvarez Bravo's 1979 photograph of Margarita de Bonampak, an indigenous girl who fiercely confronts foreigners in her homeland of the Lancandon tribe? The next artwork in this section, titled America, America, stands in stark contrast with the others. In this color screen print by the Puerto Rican artist Papo Colo, the two figures opposing each other are completely blinded and appear against a red background. Their clenched fists and the tightness of the cloth around their heads creates a feeling of urgency and desperation. The repetitive title of this print and the figures' positions facing each other point to deep-seated and cyclical racial conflicts in the United States. Though in this image, race is only visible via the hands and necklines of the figures who appear otherwise identical. What is perhaps most striking about this piece, though, is the figures' total blindness to one another. Does the artist, for his part, think there is any way out of this deep-seated and historical racial issue facing the United States and other parts of the Americas? Section 2, looking back. With an eye on the past, the second section of our exhibition provides an examination of history through places. Unlike the last section, whose works often pitted us as viewers against the subjects of the pieces, this section privileges colonial environments. Some works in this section look back with a chronicler's eye, asking viewers to consider the history of colonialism and its aftermath. Others engage with geography. How does colonialism fundamentally shape spaces, or in other cases, not? In other moments, the works relate to the past on a mythic level, transcending notions of historical time. Geometric barriers abound in Tamayo's painted cascading walls of this village, or pueblo. The corners of the buildings intersect and turn in order to create the sense of impenetrability for the viewer. The carefully coordinated color scheme consisting of a muted, darker palette leads the eye in diagonals, away from our current position, but in variable directions. How do you feel when you look at this artwork? Fundamentally inaccessible and devoid of human figures, this work creates a sense of exclusion. The viewer may look back as they leave the comfort of their home, but we could equally be curious outsiders of the village. Turning back to the first section for a moment, we observe a photograph of the empty yet once bustling Alhambra Palace in Spain. Like this image, that one places the viewer as an outsider, though here the separation is geographic as opposed to temporal, as in the Alhambra piece. How does placing these images in conversation inform your view of history?
Hi, my name is Alejandra, and I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. And I'm going to be taking you through just a couple more of the artworks that are included in the second section of the exhibition, Looking Back. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is Berta Otoya's Serpiente from 2010, translated into serpent or snake in English. And Berta Otoya is a Peruvian-born artist. She later moved to the United States, and she was originally very well known for her textile work, which incorporated traditional Peruvian techniques into tapestries and quilts. So though it's a different medium, this current piece, Serpiente, has some of the elements that are reminiscent of her textile background. Weaving tapestries is also very detail-oriented, pattern-based, and has a repetitive nature to it. The repetition of patterns has always carried stories through time, has figuratively kept the thread of narrative going. And in this piece, Serpiente, we also see that repetitive, meticulous work, handwriting, those small circles and the details that connect us to the past. So as you can see, Serpiente is a very textual image. The background is actually drawn with Sharpie marker and then overlaid with an acrylic block print. And Berta Otoya often has cursive handwriting as part of her artwork. In this piece, we have a story written on this bottom section. Now there's no citation to it, which is already interesting. Otoya often incorporates or appropriates text from other cultures and in languages which are not her native language. In this way, decontextualizing those stories and divorcing them from their origins. She then puts them into her own conversation, which is very rich and generative. So this text we have here is in English, and it seems to be some type of tale about the origin of the sea. If you go to the exhibition in person, you can read it with more time. So this bottom section has that story, and then the top section has this series of numbered fish drawings. And I think we can read some type of interaction between the fish and the text. They almost mirror each other. It's the same fish over and over, always with slight variations. She never draws them quite the same. And it's just like the way a story is passed down, whether orally or through inscription. It's always a little different. It varies as it passes from storyteller to storyteller. This textual background feels like a very concrete way of connecting to the past by literally embodying it with the hand and writing out physically those origin stories, drawing that original fish, the aquatic animal that we all come from, over and over again. Something about this practice really feels like a way to inhabit another time. At the same time, we have this serpent overlay that just juts across the page. And it feels different than the rest of the work. It's much more monstrous and slightly sinister. Maybe we can think of this serpent as something that interrupts the transmission of narrative, impedes or distorts it. Whatever it could be, the overlay juxtaposes the text underneath and makes the meaning of this piece very shifty, because based on these relationships between all the parts. I'm really drawn to this piece because of the way it allows me to connect almost bodily to the artist. The technique used, the small circles, the details, I can imagine Otoya's hand touching the paper. And in her marks, you can see the way she moved. I just find it so open, the way that her work registers her traces and really lends to historical imagination. So the next piece I'm going to be talking about is Cecilia Vicuña's Tres Cruces, or Three Crosses, from 1992. And this is a mixed media piece made of sticks and strings that the artist found on a walk one day. And this piece looks at the past in several ways. Off the bat, it references a popular Argentine folk song about three men who die in a drunken knife fight. The story goes that following the accident, the townspeople mark their graves with crosses, 3 of them, and drape them with tobacco and fruits. Passerby who come across the memorial could take what they needed from the offerings and leave prayers in return, in this way preserving the men's memories. In that sense, when we look at the three crosses, the Tres Cruces, we are also preserving the memory of those lost men and continuing the reach of that story and that song. Cecilia Vicuña's artwork is always interested with bringing back memories that are just below the surface, that can only be heard softly or through memory. The materials themselves, sticks and string, are held together so precariously. The slightest disturbance could break apart the crosses. And that is one of the deeper messages of this piece. This art speaks to a precarious world, where human existence is tenuous under the conditions of climate change, global capitalism, and racism. Vicuña's art is ephemeral and disintegrates over time. In a museum context, this work is quite confrontational. Museums were created to preserve artworks, to keep them for future generations as emblems of culture. This work is made of naturally decomposing materials, and it challenges the mission of the museum. Tres Cruces survives by becoming a part of collective memory, by imprinting on the viewer, and as such will live on beyond the physical object we have here, and definitely live on beyond the museum walls. And lastly, we have Sandy Rodriguez's map of Los Angeles from 2019. And this is a really special and obviously colorful map, one that is so rooted in place and full of historical references, botanical knowledge, and animal life. Sandy Rodriguez's maps are always layered with meaning, and they speak about history, memory, politics, and culture. This map was originally on amate paper, which was the traditional writing surface of the Mexica, the indigenous group that many people know as the Aztecs. They would have historically lived on what is now Southern California. Sandy is very intentional with where her materials come from and which histories they reference. She makes these as indigenous to the place as possible. She has spent a lot of her time studying the botanical diversity of the places she maps. And not only does she incorporate local species into her artwork, you can see if you can identify some species here, but she actually makes her own paints with the plants that are native to each place, learning those techniques and connecting to the plants in a completely different way. So this map is a record of Los Angeles in so many ways, one of them being this rich information that it contains about the local plant life. Another thing you'll notice here is the perspective. It's not the typical top-down, perfectly ordered and scaled map that is part of the Western tradition. Here we have kind of a bird's eye view, but there's also a horizon, a limit to what we can see. This grounds us in the place of the map, and it allows us to see the space in a different way. This map interrupts the long history that connects cartography and imperial expansion. The mapping of the non-Western world by Europeans went hand in hand with its imperial domination, and also ushered in a way of representing space that was very abstract and detached from the local experience. The map we have here is a departure from that tradition, and further a criticism of it. Here we have two close-up images from the map, and we can see that Sandy is really interested in representing stories that she feels are important to the space of Los Angeles. We have on the left highways crisscrossing across the land. In both images, plants that mark different spaces and ecosystems. And then in the right image, scenes of violence that remind us of the contested nature of these territories. So, and with that, thank you very much. And I will leave it now to Gabriel, who's going to be introducing section 3 of the exhibition.
Section 3, Mirada incómoda. Mirada incómoda means an uncomfortable gaze, and the section is all about how artists have dealt with uncomfortable topics caused by colonialism. One of the themes in this section is absurdity, because many artists find humor to be an effective way to confront heavy topics, such as imperialism and environmental extraction. You'll find, for example, a silly recreation of a myth involving Christopher Columbus and a hard-boiled egg, a cannibalistic parody of Warhol's tomato soup, and an anti-diarrheal medicine advertisement. We often laugh when we feel uncomfortable, so it's no surprise that artists have taken this route towards criticizing society and those in power. The pieces in this section also emphasize materiality and its link to the environment, since the environmental costs of colonialism in the Americas have been tremendous. One work is made of rice paper so thin it could almost crumble to the touch, and it tracks forest fires in the Amazon. Another piece, a seemingly illegible newspaper, is just begging to be picked up and read. If there's one theme you might focus on while walking through this section, it's discomfort. Try to notice the different approaches these artists are taking to make you feel uncomfortable, visually, materially, thematically. If you laugh, what causes that sensation? What about if you cringe? We know colonialism is no joke, but sometimes humor is the best way to break the ice for a topic that can lead to a lot of awkward interactions. Diálogo incómodo by Antonio Seguí. Diálogo incómodo was made in Argentina in 1964, but the content is all too familiar. Looking at the lithograph, you get this feeling that the figures in the space are both structurally sound and utterly disjointed. There are 4 clear quadrants, but sometimes figures bleed out into other segments. And cubes, in which many of the figures are contained, are full of surprises that can feel disorienting. In some cases, the cube boxes conceal bodies, and all we see are faces popping up. At other times, the cubes frame the faces of figures, and we're not sure what's a reflection or refraction from a different quadrant. It's kind of pushing us into a house of mirror territories, where distortion is the MO. Thematically, we see grotesque representations of men in suits with their elongated tongues sticking out. Some of the men are skeletal, others kind of look like goblins. They represent politicians who seem unable to communicate with each other, much like our current political moment, not just in the United States, but across the Americas. The name of the lithograph, Diálogo Incómodo, means an uncomfortable conversation. When I look at these off-putting political elites in their deformed bodies hidden by suits, I ask myself if the artist, Antonio Segui, is referring to a historically specific uncomfortable conversation, or a more broad problem he sees with Latin America's global positioning and continuous colonial subjugation, and the many uncomfortable conversations that arise from it. To me, this piece suggests that uncomfortable conversations are productive. We need to have way more of them to resist the self-interested political elites and their influences. After all of the grotesque men in this piece sort of look the same, don't they? They can pop into a cube and come out in a different section, but that doesn't make them unique. Like the lithograph itself, a medium that can be reprinted and reproduced in mass, like a stamp. The problems depicted in Diálogo Incómodo are pretty universal and broadly applicable across countries and historical periods. Desinformiu, Décio Pignatari. Desinformiu is a bit of an unusual piece to have in a museum exhibit. It's a concrete poem, which is a type of playful visual poem in which the meaning of words matters as much as their visual configurations. So, like, the letters in words don't only work as symbols of language, they're also infrastructure, like concrete, and build images in the poems. At the top of this piece, we can see the words perturbações intestinais, intestinal disturbances, breaking down into a red clump, much like food going through the digestive process. Luckily, the letters forming the word desinformiu, the name of the anti-diarrheal medicine, are there to save the day and clog up the area from which the red clump of digestive disturbances would be expelled. This poem is also an actual advertisement for anti-diarrheal medicine that Brazilian poet and advertiser Décio Pignatari first made for a pharmaceutical company before adding to an avant-garde poetry collection. Part of Pignatari's project is, and yes, I know this becomes quite ironic in the context of our exhibit, to take visual art and poetry out of museums, out of the ivory tower, and bring it into everyday life and industry. For him, advertisements are pieces of art that can be appreciated by a much larger public than a museum audience. But this piece in particular has an edge to it because it's about diarrhea. And the words in the poem form an intestinal tract in a clump of, well, word diarrhea. Desinformiu reminds us that if real art is about life, about real life, and about the mass and for the mass consumer, then sometimes it should be about topics that afflict everyone at some point in their lives, but can be hard to talk about, right? An uncomfortable conversation, perhaps. In this case, that topic is indigestion.
Similar to Pignatari's Desinformiu, Mirada de Azevedo was interested in drawing the viewer's attention to print media and our reliance on media for information in this piece titled Diario numerouno, año uno. Her commentary on the medium of print, however, was of a different sort than Pignatari's Desinformiu. In this work, Gonzales situated the value in the materiality and aesthetics of the newspaper, which was often treated as secondary to the printed words and stories. Gonzales problematized the superiority of alphabetic writing by constructing her columns of symbols and lines, urging viewers to consider the importance of verbal language, particularly in South America, where various indigenous populations prioritize oral communication to the written word. With no clear written message for the readers to gather from the newspaper, she thus prompted viewers to meditate on the design and materials, perhaps urging us to question where ink and paper come from and whose bodies and lands are sacrificed so that we may read the paper with our morning coffee. Imagine reading Diario numerouno during your morning routine. What might you learn that's not in the Times or the Chronicle? Leopoldo Méndez was the founder of the leftist graphic arts workshop known as the Taller de Gráfica Popular. And in this piece, viewers are provided a layered but compact statement about the role of art in turbulent times. In this linotype, a popular technique used for its mass reproducibility, the artist represents his predecessor, José Guadalupe Posada, the famous engraver, at work in his workshop. Méndez depicts Posada in a moment of distraction. His attention has been drawn away from his engraving to the scene of police repression of a protest just outside. Or is he perhaps mentally recording the incident so that he can represent it in his engraving? Behind Posada wait both the printer and anarchist Ricardo Flores Magón, who holds a written indictment of conscription as a form of class war. Is this the text that will accompany Posada's image? With this linotype, Méndez appears to be stating that revolutionaries and artists should work together against subjugation and social injustices, both directly and indirectly. Section 4, Overlooked. In section 4, we were interested in gathering objects that could speak to issues that have arisen from colonialism, but perhaps do not always get the attention they deserve. The artists and subjects included in this section used artistic expression to bring awareness to themes of injustice, ignorance, violence, and oppression, among others. As you consider objects from this section, we invite you to think about the artists and their subjects, and the ways in which they were overlooked throughout history. Several artists included here use visual metaphors to shed light on what is socially erased: the agency of women, femicide, AIDS, and labor rights, to name a few. With these pieces, the artists ask us to acknowledge aspects of our society and history that we overlook, consciously or unconsciously. When confronted with these issues, how do you respond? This Spanish sculpture of the Madonna in a naturalistic pose highlights the contours of her body. She stands atop a stylized cloud, similar to cloud forms found in Mexican codices. The sculptor of this small effigy is unknown, which limits our ability to know the intentions of the piece, but also encourages us to consider why the name of this artist was never recorded. Why was this artist not given credit for their labor? The survival of this piece, despite not having a famous, let alone named artist, is likely due to the fact that from early in the colonial project, Mary resonated with indigenous converts to Christianity. Her image appeared on the peasant Juan Diego's cloak, leading to the rise of the famous Mexican Virgin of Guadalupe, which continues to be an important pilgrimage site for Catholics. Considering what we do know about this sculpture, what can it tell us about labor rights, religion, and agency? Ana Mendieta is known for powerful performances on subjects related to ecological devastation and feminism. In this work, originally performed on the rooftop of the Hotel Principal in Oaxaca, Mexico, Mendieta shrouded her body in a white cloth, soaked herself in blood, and placed an animal heart over her stomach. The materials she used layered the performance with meaning. The shroud anonymizes the mutilated body, while simultaneously connecting it to the natural world. And the blood and heart recall both Catholic and Aztec rituals related to sacrifice and rebirth. But strongest among her myriad messages is the condemnation of violence against women, especially when we consider the country in which she performed this piece. Mexico has one of the highest rates of femicide in the world, and that rate is only rising. For Mendieta, this protest against femicide has a particularly tragic resonance, given that she died under suspicious circumstances, leading to the indictment of her husband for her murder. Although he was later acquitted after a 3-year court case, the verdict remains controversial. With the rising rate of femicide, not just in Mexico, but in other countries around the world, it's clear that Mendieta's performance continues to be a timely political statement. A prolific artist of the 80s and 90s, Felix Gonzales Torres often blurred the lines between public and private, using his art to make commentaries on the AIDS epidemic and death, often relying on mundane materials like light bulbs, hard candies, stacks of paper, and clocks to communicate his messages. This piece was made shortly before the artist's death from AIDS in 1996, and there is no detailed record of the sculpture's significance. But given Gonzales Torres's interest in sharing his personal experience as an AIDS-positive homosexual man and cultural activist through his art, enables us to imagine what this pair of rings meant to him. These two circles are perfect forms on their own, but together they form an infinity. So having lost his partner to the same disease that was killing him, it can be powerful to think about the rings as a symbol of love everlasting. Or perhaps they serve as a commentary on the untimely cycle of life and death for HIV and AIDS positive populations at a time when governments were not responding to the epidemic adequately or appropriately. Looking at these brass rings, what do they symbolize to you? Much of Francisco Zúñiga's work as a painter and sculptor focuses on human figures and female bodies, especially Indigenous women. Set to an undefined tan background, this nameless Yucateca both stands out and blends in. She likely represents maternal family responsibility, a source of Mexican pride to Zúñiga. While he sought to elevate Indigenous women in his figurative works, this Yucateca does not seem amused in her position as a subject, nor in her pairing with a native fruit. Would she be pleased to be associated with domesticity or with Indigenous objects? Her eyes and frown suggest a resentment Zúñiga may have missed or misinterpreted in his depictions of Mexican women. Whatever the artist or subject's intentions, with this piece, we're able to imagine the protests of women as solely domestic figures or embodiments of the earth and its abundance, not just in South America, but throughout the world. Thank you for participating in our virtual tour. Please visit bampfa.org for more information.